Sindya, this is your first event since the book came out?
It is. Actually,
Yay!
I'm in Kansas right now doing a visiting writer thing in Wichita. So I actually had an event a few days ago, even before the book came out.
They got the sneak preview.
They did. Yeah. Yeah. And the local bookstore here was able to get the books in advance. So it was nice.
That's awesome. I actually saw your book. I went to the library with my son today and your book was there and I was very excited. I was like, I want to check it out, but I already have it. And I was telling the librarians, I was like, you need to put this one right here because it was in the new area.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, you guys need to read this. I need to get to the bookstore though. So as soon as I can get to the books, books right up there. It makes me so happy.
All right, it looks like a good amount of people are in now. So hello, everybody. I'm Elisa Martinez, and I am an event staffer here at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I would like to welcome you to PNP Live. We appreciate you joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we've been working really hard to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our PNP community. At any point during the event, you can click the link in the chat to purchase Seeking Fortune Elsewhere directly from the Politics and Prose website. If you look near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. You can click there to submit a question to our author, and we try our best to get to everyone's questions, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time before we get to yours. We are also providing closed captions, so if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen again, those will be available. So before we begin, I'd like to say thank you again for being here. We're immensely grateful for you all helping keep our business and spirits afloat. And now I would like to welcome to PNP Live, Sindya Bhanoo, celebrating the release of her book, Seeking Fortune Elsewhere. Sindya Bhanoo's fiction has appeared in Granta, New England Review, Glimmer Train, and elsewhere. She's the recipient of an O. Henry Award, the Disquiet Literary Prize, and scholarships from Breadloaf and Sewanee Writers Conference. A longtime newspaper reporter, she has worked for the New York Times and the Washington Post. She's a graduate of the Michener Center for Writers, UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, and Carnegie Mellon University. In Seeking Fortune Elsewhere, Sindya Bhanoo's haunting stories show us how immigrants' paths and the paths of those they leave behind are never simple. Bhanoo takes us along on their complicated journeys where regret, hope, and triumph appear in disguise. Sindya will be in conversation with Lara Prescott. Prescott is the author of The Secrets We Kept, an instant New York Times bestseller, and Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick. The Secrets We Kept was an Edgar Award finalist for Best First Fiction and the winner of 2019 Writers League of Texas Book Award in Fiction, and will be adapted for television by the Ink Factory. Lara received her MFA from the Michener Center for Writers at the University of Texas. Prior to writing fiction, Lara worked as a political campaign consultant. So please join me in welcoming Sindya Bhanoo and Lara Prescott to PNP Live.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing some friends pop up in the chat. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to talk about this brilliant collection. And I just wanted to say a few words about this collection before we start in the questions. I mean, something that people don't really know about the publishing world is that short story collections, especially from a debut author, are almost impossible to publish. Publishing is a strange, strange world. I mean, I read in a recent review of Sindya's astonishing collection that her first story in the collection, Maliga Homes, was rejected 22 times before it was accepted and eventually won one of the most prestigious short story awards out there, the O. Henry Prize. I have no doubt that this collection and her future work will go on to win more awards. The act of writing, of sitting down at one's desk to create something that comes from a deep place inside ourselves, feels like a different world entirely than publishing. When I first finished reading Sindya's collection, I went back to the epigraph. Do you understand the sadness of geography? It summed up the feeling I was left with after reading these amazing stories. It is also the feeling I think many humans, myself included, share when they choose to leave someone behind in order to forge a new path in life. I purchased this collection for my mother. Somehow, Sindya has said in these 8 stories what I have failed to articulate to her. That is why I'm so thankful that your collection is here for the world to read and that your excellent publisher and editor has treated it with so much respect, love, and care. I hope that everyone clicks on the link in the chat and purchases this beautiful book from Politics and Prose tonight if you haven't bought it already. If you have bought it, buy it for your friends, for your family, and share it widely. I think this is a great book for discussions, a great book for book clubs. But most of all, I want to congratulate Sindya on this amazing accomplishment. I'm so excited to ask you so many questions, and I hope we can get to them all. So I want to ask you first, if you could tell us a little bit about your collection in your own words.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And it's so special to be here with you. We're classmates, of course, from the Michener Center, and we both lived in DC, so Politics and Prose also means something to each of us. My collection, Seeking Fortune Elsewhere, is a collection of 8 stories. 4 stories are set in the United States and 4 are set in India. And these are stories about South Indian immigrants from the state of Tamil Nadu, and sort of their journeys, the paths they take in the US, but also about the family they leave behind. And I think there are so many amazing writers telling the varied stories of the immigrant experience. But what is common and what never changes and what will never change is that family is left behind. And even as plane travel has become less expensive over the course of my childhood, even as technology has changed and we have WhatsApp and FaceTime and all of these different ways to stay connected, that geographic distance is still there. It always will be there. And it's meant so much to me. People who've read some of these stories have reached out, and although their family is in the United States, they read some of these stories during the pandemic, and everyone has felt that sort of sadness of being separated from family during these last couple of years.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And, I felt the same way. And reading your collection, I immediately was like, I need to send this to my family. I want them to understand, what you've written and how much it sums up the feelings I've felt. So I think that's such a tremendous accomplishment as a writer. So in each of the 8 stories of your collection, there's always someone or someone missing: a parent, a child, an entire family, connection to one's culture. The reasons range from immigration to death to not being able to leave, or the decision to go in search of something else. Were you thinking of this theme as a common thread that ties the collection together?
I wasn't fully aware that I was writing a collection. I think I was working on these stories one by one. But I think that we have certain obsessions as writers, and those things keep coming up in our writing. And I think I am obsessed with that absence. I haven't. These stories are fiction, and I haven't experienced all of the things that my characters have, but each of them, I think it does feel that sort of loss and absence of someone or some people in their lives. And my parents are immigrants from India. They came here in the late 1970s, and I didn't grow up with cousins or grandparents or aunts or uncles. They did, and my children now have grandparents that they see more often, and cousins and aunts and uncles. But I don't know exactly what that feels like to gather over the holidays, to know my grandparents, like what it's like inside their house on a daily basis, the smells and peculiarities of your grandparents. All of that I don't know, and I never will know. I think I'm always trying to explore it, though, and try to understand that absence a little better.
Yeah, I mean, so many of these stories contain almost characters that are almost nostalgic for lives that they haven't lived, or the lives that they lived that they wish they've lived differently. And they're faced with kind of a loneliness of the decisions that they've made. And I think that's really interesting juxtaposition of like people going out and making their way, but the consequences that has. And really, most of these stories involve women characters, which I really loved. And these women characters are often asserting their independence in order to follow their own path, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. I think what has drawn you to create characters, especially women characters, that are searching for this type of power to go out on their own, but are faced with lingering consequences?
Yeah, seven out of the 8 stories have women as a woman as the main character. I think I am interested. I started writing, I think, because I'm interested in sort of the larger record, like what are the stories in the American record, what's missing, and I think that stories of women often are missing, and fiction is a chance to go back and correct that. I think that's part of it, part of what I was interested in. I also think that as a society we celebrate these huge things like big accomplishments, and we celebrate CEOs and politicians, but power, exercising power can happen in sort of more private ways, in smaller moments, and it's no less an act of bravery. I think it requires a lot, and you really understand who a person is if you look at that closely. So I think in these stories, in the lives of these women, I tried to pay attention to that, to spend time with them every day and see what they're doing, and sort of these simple decisions, I mean, complicated decisions, but what might seem like small ones that they choose to make. Yeah, that are really very brave.
Yeah, I think within the ordinary, within the daily lives of these women, I agree. I feel like I see such bravery. And to me, that's more interesting than hearing how, the CEO made his millions or whatever. This is these small acts, which are really a lot. And there's quite a number of those stories where you're rooting for these women and hoping that they take back this power, or, despite it not always being part of the cultural norms at the time. And again, like mothers and motherhood and parenthood in general is a theme throughout the novel. And I was wondering, what do you think it is about motherhood and all its crazy complexities and that really draws you in as a fiction writer?
I started writing only after I became a mother. I think that may be part of it, part of my interest in sort of the role of mothers. I don't know what I think also it's such a complex role that the mother plays, and in modern society, in India in particular, as the country has modernized, many women work and they bring home the same paychecks as their husbands, and they're sort of they're breadwinners for the family, but still running the household, still taking on the role of doing all the housework and taking care of the children. It has become really complex, and I think looking at that has been really interesting for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you do a really fine job of showing that imbalance of power and those dynamics are really explored in such an intimate level, because you're seeing these people live their daily lives and experience, what it's like to be in their shoes for a moment. So I want to I want to talk about Western PA, because we've both lived in Western PA, and people might not even know this, but we might have played each other in tennis in high school. I don't remember. I'm sure you beat me, but I know our schools played and we were around the same time. So I get such a kick out of seeing, anyone really does. You see where you're from depicted in fiction or in a movie, and you're just like thrilled with it. So your mentions of Monroeville Mall and other things in Western PA that really embodied my growing up in the 90s. I just absolutely love it. I think your sense of place is so spot on. And something I love about this collection is you take us to Western PA. You also take us to Bangalore and everywhere in between. And something I was really interested in knowing is, one, do you write the characters and then find the place, or does the place start and you find the characters? How does that, when you're writing fiction, you're like, I'm going to set this here, and these are the characters that I see, or how did that come about?
Yeah. Well, so we both were teenagers in Western Pennsylvania at the same time, and you probably beat me at tennis because your mom was the coach.
That's true.
But yeah, we may have passed each other in Monroeville Mall,
smoking cigarettes in the parking lot.
But yeah, I mean, it was really interesting for me to think of these places. Most of the places in the book I've lived, or in the case of India, I've visited many times. No place feels quite like home, I think, for me. None of these cities feel like a homeland or a home, but a part of me belongs to all of them, and so I incorporated all these different parts of the United States and also India into my stories. I don't think that I'm thinking of a specific geographic place when I start writing, but I am thinking of a location like Monroeville Mall, or a specific house, or a person in a certain vehicle. It's not that the sense of place for me is not tied to a certain city, I don't think, or a certain state. It's almost a little more precise than that, and it may be because I don't have that sense of home, maybe, that other people do.
I think that feeling is in many of your stories of, people that don't have a sense of home, or have had a home and it's changed so much, or they're being pushed out of their homes, or their homes are changing. And I think that is a theme that maybe gradually unfolded and came out in the collection. And I think many people can relate to that. And I just, it takes so many forms. Were you kind of exploring this feeling from all different angles to get at maybe a deeper truth of what that means to be apart from home or have your home change?
I don't know. I mean, it might be in that sense of longing that people have as they're kind of, grasping for something. Like I feel each character is grasping for something that they can't quite get, whether it's their daughter in another country, or their daughters in another state, or a sense of who they are. There's a professor in one of the stories whose world is turned upside down, and he just kind of loses sense of who he is, and that's what he's grasping for.
Yeah, it's almost a loss of who he thought he was and who he thought he was perceived as. And it's devastating to see it unfold, and the cluelessness, but also the way he's reacting to it. I think that was such a great story. I think something that brings to mind home and is in many of your stories, and also made me hungry a lot of times, is food, and either cooking food, providing people with food, gathering to eat food is a prevalent subject matter in a lot of these stories. And I was wondering, what significance does food have for your characters?
I think food. I think that when immigrants come to a new country, there's a lot of assimilation that happens very quickly. Very quickly, language is lost. I can speak Tamil, but my children can't, and that will soon be completely lost, I think. You change the way you dress, and you change the way you speak, your interests. I mean, a lot of things you kind of adapt and you assimilate. But food, I think, lasts in a family for more generations somehow. For many, I mean, there are Indian communities who have been in in the Caribbean, in Africa for many generations, and they still retain food. And that's really interesting to me, that's present. And generations later, someone in the United States may be making the same food that their ancestors made in India. So that was interesting for me and important for me to incorporate. I think also these stories, because they do feature women, and women are in charge of the kitchen in these stories and in the communities that I'm writing about. It's kind of like a quiet place for them to think, and it was a place for me to observe them thinking as they work. And I think the idea of these characters having longings and thoughts about home, what they left behind, eating the food that they had in the place they once lived, it's such a sensory experience. It brings everything back. So there was some of that as well. And during the pandemic, I made a little bit more Indian food than I used to, and I made I made this crepe called dosa, and it requires like fermenting lentils and adding rice flour. And I was doing that, and it was astounding to me to sort of understand and realize that people had been making this for thousands of years. That thousands of years ago, my ancestors, women in my family, may have been making this. So I think it's very powerful for that reason.
Absolutely. And for anyone wondering, Sindya is an amazing cook. My husband still talks about the food you made us for dinner that one time and how amazing it was. So as I was reading some of these stories, I kind of was recalling, all the tastes and smells of the food you made me, which I felt like was such a gift as a friend to do. I just want to remind everyone, I want to leave some time for questions from the audience. So please type in your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end of the event. So don't forget to just type in anything you're thinking. For me, I keep going back and forth with what my favorite story is. And I think your collection is one of those books that I'm going to keep returning to again and again, because different stories make me feel different ways. And I think that's such a great sign where if you're at a different place in your life, you can relate to one more than the other. I know that my favorite story in the collection, because of the way you use perspectives and just the voice of the piece, is Amma. And while reading it, I really felt like you, as the author, just like placed a recorder down and was in front of these group of women saying, like, spill the secrets, tell me your story. And I know you're really interested in oral tradition and recording stories. So I was thinking about that in the background. And I wanted to know, one, is that, influential in your writing, that interest in recording people's stories and histories? And I also want to know, part two of the question is, how did the character Jaya come about? I feel like she's partially based on a historical figure, but I'm not positive.
Yeah. I think that I am interested in oral histories, and I think I realized in my work as a newspaper reporter for many years that there's a lot of stories that we miss, and some of those are not ones that can ever make headlines and will never make the newspaper, but they're ones that we want to record, about stories about daily life, stories about how people feel after a major event. I think, all the days that follow a tragedy, we sometimes forget about. So I think fiction is a chance to do that. Recording stories, oral histories, are a chance to capture a little bit more of that. The story of Amma, that character is based on a real life politician and movie actress. She was the star, the heroine of her time, named Jaya. And I am often starting with an image when I'm writing, and in that case, I had this image. She was in office when I was a child, and so when I visited India, I remember being stuck in traffic because her caravan of cars would be going by, and you wouldn't know which one she was in, but she was in an ambassador. And so I just had that image, and then I had read about her life, and she died a few years ago. So I started thinking about it, and what was most interesting to me was not necessarily her life, but all the people who may have known her at a different stage in life, and how they must have, I mean, how strange to have a childhood friend or classmate who then has this sort of insane life trajectory where, you're a cinema star, and then a politician and the head of the state, and really kind of worshipped by so many people. So that's how I started imagining the life of, or how her classmates saw her over the course of her lifetime.
And you do such a great job of time in this piece, where you see time passing from childhood, and as these women are aging, and insecurities coming out, or things that they wish had happened, or projections onto this woman, both rumors, or wishing they were her. And I think it's just such right material to explore. And I think there was such moments of humor, and also really heartbreaking moments. So I absolutely love that. And you mentioned in that answer that you have been a long-time journalist, writing in newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I think probably a lot of people will ask you this, but I really am interested, because I don't have that experience of having mastered another genre of writing, or another element of writing. And I want to know how your journalism has influenced your fiction, or if it hasn't, or if there's totally different mindsets.
Yeah. I think it definitely has. I think that when I was a reporter, I saw the limits of journalism, how far a story can go, and then it stops. You write a newspaper story about something that happens, and then that's it. And people sometimes tell you a lot more, and they tell you interesting things, but it's not relevant to that particular story. Years ago, when I was an intern at the Washington Post, one of the first stories that I was assigned was to cover the death of a man who died in a public housing complex, and he was sort of forgotten. The city didn't tell his family. The police didn't tell his family. He was in the morgue for a week before his sister found out. So it was kind of, and the housing complex didn't call. It was this kind of error that everyone made, and they apologized for it. And I wrote a story about that. It was very small, assigned to an intern. It was inside the paper. But afterwards, the man's mother called me and invited me over for meatloaf. And she just wanted to talk about her son, and meatloaf was her favorite, his favorite dish that she made. And I just felt I couldn't do that as a reporter. I couldn't go to her house. I also was done with the story and had moved on. But when I hung up, I just felt like I was missing something. Like there was something that I hadn't done full justice to this story, but in particular to this mother's story. And I think as a fiction writer, I realized the value in looking a little closer at that. Like how does it feel to live every day of your life after your son dies this way and everyone forgot about him? How does it feel to make meatloaf? How does a mother reckon with that? So I think fiction has the power to do that, which journalism oftentimes doesn't. But reporting, which I still do not so often anymore, I think gives me entry into worlds that would otherwise not be accessible to me, I think. I'm working now on a special project on missing women with 10 other reporters covering the 50 states. And I'm working on 5 states. And I think, learning about these stories of women who just disappear and talking to detectives and families, that's not something I would otherwise be able to access. I think reporting gives me this special access. It keeps me immersed in the world in a way that I otherwise wouldn't be. So I'm very grateful for that training, and it's a privilege to step into people's worlds in that way.
I think what you said so eloquently is, there's this tragic moment and we hear about it in the news, or maybe it's just a blip on TV or a small thing in the newspaper. And we don't know, what's the story after that? What's like the mother's grief for her son? And, I think your story, Nature Exchange, really touches on that. And, it starts off and you want to, there's a death of a child, and this is the aftermath of that event. And it's the type of event, where if it was a larger tragedy, you'd probably hear it on the news all the time, but it's probably something that was, heard of, and then people forget about it in the next news cycle. But we're with this woman, we're with her as she's holding on to that. And I think I can see that want for you to kind of spend that time with her and give her that respect of the character. And I think so much is illuminated through that story and what it means to grieve, and what it means to have such a tragic loss, and also, what it means to kind of find this little piece of hope in it, which I think your stories all contain this little bit of hope, even if we're talking about loneliness and sadness, but this is not the type of book where you're coming away feeling almost empowered and almost like you've been seen. And that's such a feeling of hope for so many of these characters at the end. So don't get me wrong, if you haven't read we're saying, there's so much loneliness, but there is so much joy, and there's so much, these little moments of happiness, which I think just stick in your mind. So that's so interesting that was part of your journalism experience, of like where you had to kind of stop the story and how it might have, filtered into future stories.
Yeah,
And
I think that, go ahead.
No, continue.
That story is about a school shooting and a woman who loses her child, and then I am looking at what it's like afterwards. But even a really joyous moment, like we hire photographers and videographers for our on wedding days and graduation days for big events, but looking closely at every day that follows, I think really reveals the truth of a marriage, of a person. So yeah, I mean, but a tragedy, but also even a joyous occasion. I think sticking around is what fiction allows us to do.
Yeah, and it's like almost like you get to know those characters more. I mean, they could have these events that label them or that have happened to them, and you're just like, that's that person. But when you see the day-to-day of how they've lived their lives, that's when you feel like I actually do know this person. And that's something that I think fiction can really put you right there with them, and watching them or feeling what they feel. So you started off in journalism, and were you always writing fiction during this time, or was there a transition to, I'm going to start writing fiction or start studying it more seriously? How was your path towards, going the fiction route?
No, I wasn't writing fiction at all. I was always kind of curious and interested, but it just seemed like something so far away from me. I couldn't even imagine writing fiction or publishing fiction or seeing my name in a book. Those people just seemed like they weren't human. Whoever was doing that, whoever those writers were with books in bookstores and libraries seemed kind of like superhuman. So no, I just never tried. I didn't think to try. I was happy. I love being a reporter, and I still do. So I didn't, but I had a baby and I was home a little bit more, and I just had a little bit of time, like a couple quiet hours, and I started writing little character sketches. And then I took a class. I lived in the Bay Area, and I took a class through Stanford's continuing studies program. And that teacher encouraged me to just stick with it. She kind of explained to me that what makes a writer is that that person's writing. That's the only thing that distinguishes someone who's a writer and someone who's not. So she just told me to keep writing, and so that's how I started. But in addition, I think in that moment when I had a baby, I also felt this huge, I just realized that if I didn't write these stories down, no one else would, and they wouldn't exist for her, and they wouldn't exist for me, and they wouldn't be in that larger record, which is so important to me, that these stories exist, and that they're not just for, you know, the readers of today and tomorrow, but for the readers of all time. And it almost is less important to me that everyone finds these stories now. It's more important, I think, that it becomes part of the archive. And journalism is like that too. We write those stories, we write down other people's stories so that they're now. It's a public service, so we inform people about what's going on, but also so it exists for, you know, 100 years from now or 200 years from now for people to go back to. So that's kind of how I transitioned.
Yeah, I totally relate to the not thinking being a writer was ever possible for me, and having this other career, and thinking like, who are these writers? Who are these like magical creatures that can just do it? And I think most writers probably feel that way, and maybe even still feel that way after they publish books. And but I think it is so important, and something I think that fiction can do is, like I said, like I'm thinking of your book, and I can see myself reading it again and again. It's one of those books that will not only be in the archive, but it kind of like sits with me. And maybe it's just because of who I am, but fiction can do that to me, and no other outlet can. I mean, I feel like it can connect with people on this really intimate level. And I think that this collection definitely does that. I'm kind of interested in the nuts and bolts of story collections. I want to know, like, what was the first story you wrote? What was the last? And when did you think, okay, I have a collection here. This is what I'm doing. I have a book in the works.
The very first story I wrote is called His Holiness. That's the story set in Pittsburgh, where you recognize Monroeville and the Mall and 376. That story is among the first stories I ever wrote, and I applied to the Michener Center, to the MFA program we went to, with that story, and all of the rest I wrote during my time at our MFA program. The last story I wrote was Nature Exchange, and actually that story was a replacement. So the character in Nature Exchange, her name is Vina, and her grandmother has a story in the book called Mulliga Holmes. And there was a different story about Vina when she was much younger. She didn't have a son. In the story, she has a son who dies in a school shooting. But that earlier story, when she's kind of in her early 20s, it didn't quite fit into this book. So we pulled it out and then added in Nature Exchange. I mean, your question about when did I know it was a collection, or how did it come to be a collection? I don't think that I knew that at all. I didn't know, if these stories would be published, and I didn't know that they sort of had anything in common that would tie them together. I was working with Brett Anthony Johnston at the Michener Center at the time, and he read a couple, and he pointed out sort of some commonalities. And I actually had this concern that I was writing the same story over and over in a slightly different way. But I think actually that's what makes a story collection powerful, when you're revisiting certain ideas, and each story is trying to understand it. Like we talked about the absence and the longing and the role of women, and trying to understand the changing role of women. So that was my curiosity, I think, and it happened that I was investigating it through these stories of these South Indian immigrants that had come to the United States. So I think I think that it just came together a little more organically. I did not set out to write a collection.
I think it's also interesting, there's short story collections that are linked, they have the same characters and you kind of follow progression. But a lot of these stories, they're different characters. They don't all have any relation to each other and they're going from place to place. And another thing I'm interested in is how did you decide to order the stories? Did you, put them physically, print them out and move them around? Was it like creating a old school mixtape? How did you, or did the editor have any input? Like, how did you go about it? I think because I liken it to a mixtape because it flows that way. Like from the first story to the last, you feel like you've been on a journey, which I think a good mixtape does. So I want to know how you did it.
It's hard. It's hard to figure out how to order a collection. I think that the stories, the 4 stories are set in the US and 4 in India, and I wanted to move back and forth between the 2 countries. The first story is about someone closer to the end of their life. They've lived, the majority of their life. And the last story is about a young girl who goes to India for the first time. So I liked that kind of movement. And the first and last stories touch Indian soil and American soil both. So that was nice. And then there's also kind of like the voice varies, and you want, the story Amma that you mentioned, which is a collective voice. It really felt like it should be closer to the center of the book. So those are a few things that I was thinking of, and my editor, of course, also had really great input.
Yeah, you lucked out with such a great publisher and such a great editor. I'm so excited that your collection came to them. I'm going to, in a few minutes, I'm going to switch because we have quite a few questions coming up in the Q&A, but I have a few more for you. I'm interested in writers' influences, in particularly with certain books. And I want to know, did you have any influences of writers or other stories that were inspirational or influential to this book?
I did read some collections, some writers a lot while I was writing. I was reading Chimamanda Adichie. I was reading Edwidge Danticat and William Trevor. I really love Yi-Yun Lee also. These are all writers, I think. Some of them are telling immigrant stories also, but they spend a lot of time on what's really important to me, on the characters' lives and sort of the smaller moments in their lives. They're not as obsessed with major they're not plot driven. They're really spending time with characters. So those were a few of the writers. Adichie's collection, The Thing Around Your Neck, I read several times while I was writing this book.
Oh, cool. Everyone go purchase those books and Politics and Prose. Because so many of them are, just classics. So that's really interesting to know. And I also saw that you dedicated your book to your parents, and the dedication says your parents who went elsewhere. And as you said, they came to the United States in the 1970s. And I want to know what role your parents had in you becoming a writer. And I also read in your acknowledgments that your parents gifted you with a childhood full of books. So I know that's been an influence. And I kind of just want to know, did they influence you? Did they encourage you? What books were your favorite growing up?
Oh, well, my dad is a college professor, so he is always buying books. My mom worked at the public library and believes more in borrowing books and returning them, but still between them both, I think they both really brought a lot of books into my life. And I would go to India on vacation in the summers, and there's really nothing to do there in the 1980s and 90s in a small town. It was very quiet. So I read a lot of books while I was there. So they did, I mean, I think they did fill my childhood with books and a lot of time at the public libraries. But they also kind of gave me this life where, I had this sort of very American childhood, but then also we had close ties to the Indian community in the United States. And then I spent a lot of time in India. They told me a lot of stories about the people they knew and the people, about our relatives. I mean, everything I think kind of adds up in your head. I watched a lot of 1980s like Indian movies, these extravagant like musicals that are just insane if you go back and look at them, and we watched them on VHS cassettes. But all of that kind of informed my storytelling and what I'm thinking about. And this book specifically just would not be possible without the childhood that I had and the childhood that they gave me.
Oh, that's such a gift. And I feel like your parents must be really proud of you. And that's such a wonderful, way to a dedication for them. So we have about 14 minutes left and we have quite a few questions. So I'm going to turn to some of them and maybe I can finish up my last questions if we still have time, but I'm looking in the Q&A now.
Okay.
Oh, this is a really good question. It's related to oral histories. And the question is, did you sit down with relatives, family, friends, etc., to collect stories and use it as inspiration for some of your characters?
I did not, but I have done a lot with oral histories. Was on the board of an organization called the South Asian American Digital Archive. And the goal of that is to record the stories of South Asian Americans in the United States. And there's a project that they have called the First Days Project, which is just a collection of people's stories of their first day in America. And some of them are recorded as audio, and some of them are just text. But that is just so powerful to me, like a collection of people's first days in the United States. So I didn't, but I definitely used, various stories I knew and images that I had in my work.
Okay. So you talked about one story that kind of ended up on the cutting room floor. Were there any other stories that didn't make the collection, and what were your reasons for cutting them?
There weren't any others that made that we cut, but the stories take years to revise. I mean, from start to finish, it's several years, so they change so dramatically. It's almost like you're rewriting the whole thing from scratch in certain drafts. So it was just that one story that we cut about this granddaughter Veena, but I replaced it with a story about Veena. So in a sense, it didn't completely disappear.
Let's see. One question, and you've touched on some of your themes, but how did you start the collection? Did you start with one theme, or did one develop on its own after several of the stories had been written? Or was it like you just didn't notice it until someone else was like, hey, you're writing a lot about this?
Yeah.
I feel like that's it for me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was so oblivious that I didn't realize even that all my stories had this focus on South Indian immigrants, really. I mean, that would be so obvious. It's on the back of the book, I guess, but to me, these were just these really interesting characters who hadn't had their stories told, and I wanted to spend more time with them. I think it's the very first story, Mulliga Holmes, although others were written, but the first story in the book is the one that made me start to feel like I had a collection.
I have another question. Is the main character in number 16 Model House Road based on a woman you know or a woman that you have met? She's so courageous. I agree with that.
It's so nice.
That's like that moment of bravery that's like so good, so brave, but it's this, almost a simple moment.
Yeah, I'm so happy that someone here has read Number 16 Model House Road and admires the woman in the story. That story is not based on someone that I've met, although there are scenes from Bangalore familiar to me that I've included. That story is inspired by this phenomenon I saw happening in India a couple years ago, where these old houses were being demolished and developers were essentially paying homeowners to put sort of these apartment complexes, and they would build you a brand new flat within this complex and then take the other flats and sell them off. So that was so interesting to me that that was happening. And that's a case where that's such a great story to write for the newspaper, to write about these developments, to do a business story for the business section. But that it was not what was interesting to me. I was interested in someone who was making that very difficult decision of giving up the house that they loved, and this woman whose entire life was this house. She hadn't left the home to work, so she was spending every day of her life in this home, and what it was like for her then to sell that house. That moment of bravery, she makes a decision which maybe is not the smartest decision, but she kind of is making a decision that she wants to. And so I was interested in that.
I think she made the right decision. I have another question that says, I would like to hear about the story with many rejections that ended up being an award winner. What made you continue to believe in it and keep submitting? I think this is good question for all aspiring writers out there.
Yeah, that question's from Colleen. Hi, Colleen. That it is so hard to stick with it. Sometimes the rejection is just overwhelming and it keeps coming. I think that you have to have faith in your own work, but also you need friends like Lara and peers who are also writers and who are also not, friends and family who are supporting you and who believe in you. I think that was so important for me, and also having teachers who just told me it would happen. It's a matter of time, and you just keep working on it. That story, Malika Holmes, was rejected 22 times before it was published, and each time hurts a little bit, but you just kind of stick with it.
Okay, let's see. Were you afraid of people reading into incidents in your own life? Oh, since it seems there are probably nuggets of truth in each story.
I feel like this is all fiction, but the nuggets of truth, there are kernels of truth that I'm starting with. I have to start with something, like the image I mentioned in Amma, or this phenomenon of the houses being turned to flats in Number 16 Model House Road. That will always be there. I think the kernels of truth that I start with, but there is a kind of moment when the story transcends all of that. The imagined world becomes completely its own place, and those people in it are going to do their own thing, whatever they want to. It's a really magical moment, I think. And that kernel of truth sometimes just disappears. It kind of gets washed away as the story takes over. So no, I don't think I'm worried about that.
I think it's something that maybe readers look into and they think your fiction is about your life, but oftentimes it's just fiction. I have a question from our former classmate, Sam Boyer. He says, you mentioned that your stories can evolve drastically over the course of years while editing. Which story from Seeking Fortune Elsewhere changed the most, and which do you feel changed the least?
Number 16 Model House Road maybe changed the most. There was a lot of other things going on in there. I think that the woman was spending time taking care of an elderly relative for most of the story. She wasn't selling, it wasn't about the sale of a house. There was more characters in the story. I think the daughter had a bigger role, and there was a son. So that story changed quite a bit. Which story changed the least? Probably His Holiness, the first story I wrote for the collection. I think that story has more or less stayed the same, although structurally it has changed a lot. Most of the stories, I think, structurally have changed a lot, like how I've incorporated backstory, and how I deal with chronology. I think that has changed significantly.
Do you find yourself being the type of writer who finds the structure later on most often, or do you come up with the structure that you're trying to fit the characters into?
No, I don't think I have the structure early on or the story early on. I think I just have that image and I'm going into that world, and it feels almost like reporting for me, where I'm just like in that world, writing down notes in my notebook and taking pictures and watching my characters for a lot of the time talk to each other and do things, but also asking them questions when I can, to find out what they're thinking and how they're feeling. And sometimes it's not quite right, like they're not telling me the truth, and I have to re-enter that imagined world. But I'm coming back with those bits and pieces and fragments, and it's very messy. And then it's only after that I'm trying to assemble what I have into a story for the reader. It's sort of my best attempt at sharing this world that I discovered with the reader.
Are there any stories that you might develop into a longer project, or I guess any characters or images?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I have this other story about Veena, the grandmother in Mulliga Holmes, and the granddaughter Veena. And I'm interested also in the mother who doesn't have a story of her own. I don't at this time plan to extend any of these stories, but it could happen. Jayalalitha, the character that Amma is based on, is still of interest to me. So no plans at this time, but maybe.
Never know.
Never know.
Let's see. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. Some of these questions we've chatted about in general. And again, just so you know, if you go to the chat, you can purchase Seeking Fortune Elsewhere via Politics and Prose, which is one of the best bookstores in the world. I used to live down the street from them, and it's a dream to even do an event with Politics and Prose. So thank you again for having us.
Yeah.
So the last question is, how did your ethnic background influence your writing on this project? Or did it?
Yeah. I think that when we want our stories to feel authentic and our characters to feel real. And there are different ways that is made possible. I mean, one way is to do the research, to go out and do research and read books and talk to people, or to do the kind of work I do as a reporter, which is spend a lot of time with people, ask them questions and learn about their life and try to understand them. And I think if my ethnic background influenced these stories, it was in that I kind of know a lot. There's a lot that I know that I don't have to ask. So I think that's what it is. I think I want to write these stories as authentically as possible. And I knew a lot of things. I could find out a lot of things that made these stories easier. It was easier for me to infuse them, I think, with that authenticity. But that doesn't mean that I would only write stories about people with the same ethnic background as me. But I would always want to have that authenticity, to make sure that I am really telling the stories of the people, that I'm including, of my characters.
Yeah, I think that's good advice for any writer to do. Thank you guys for so much for all these questions. I think that's going to be it for us. Everyone buy the book. It's so wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and to Politics and Prose.
Hook 'em. Yeah, I'm seeing all these friends pop up. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. So fun to see.
Yeah, it's great to have really supportive friends. I just want to say thank you both, Sindya and Lara, for taking the time to be here today, and for such an open and warm conversation. I know there was a lot that I connected to in it, and I hope that our audience members did too. I would also like to thank the audience here today, as your patronage is really what allows us to bring you programming like this. And we wouldn't be able to continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Sindya, Bhanoo, and Politics and Prose by using the link in which we have posted a couple times in the chat to purchase Seeking Fortune elsewhere. And be sure to keep an eye out on our website for our current event listings, as we have plenty of excellent events to choose from. And now they're virtual and in person. So thank you again, Sindya and Lara, for joining us today. Keep well read, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your